everyone.
Hi, Carrie. It's great to be back with you, and it's great to be with your audience.
Lovely. And hopefully this is going to work. We are having some sound issues here, but hopefully this will go through. And then the people who are listening can let us know how the sound is at both ends. So that's always an unpredictable variable. All right. So so one moment here, and I'm going to bring your bio actually from my site up here on the screen while I go over it with people, just for those that want to read it. So you are the president of Solari Inc., publisher of the Solari Report, a managing member of the Solari Investment Advisory Services, LLC, and you served as managing director and member of the board of directors of the Wall Street investment bank Dillon, Reed and Company. As Assistant Secretary of Housing and Federal Housing Commissioner at the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development in the first Bush administration, and you were president of Hamilton Securities Group. Catherine has designed and closed over 25 billion of transactions and investments to date, has led a portfolio and investment strategy for 300 billion of financial assets and liabilities. She graduated from the University of Pennsylvania, the Wharton School of Business, and studied Mandarin Chinese at Chinese University in Hong Kong. She blogs for the Solari Report at solari.com. So that's a very nuts and bolts bio, and it would be great, to get a bit more about you and where you're at now, and how much personally, perhaps, things have changed since you left what some may call the mainstream, although maybe you consider yourself still, with a foot in that world, and also kind of going down a whole different road for yourself. So do you want to cover that a bit?
Well, my interest my whole life has been understanding how we evolve our economic model on planet Earth to something much more sustainable. I grew up in a poor neighborhood and watched my neighborhood be destroyed by mortgage fraud and narcotics trafficking. It's very interesting. The common mortgage fraud during the bailouts in 2009 to 2012 are the same ones that destroyed my neighborhood. So I've kind of been at this for a while, and it just seems to be getting worse, not better. But so it's always been my interest to understand how we could evolve a healthier economic model on planet Earth. And that's taken me, I worked on Wall Street for many years, and I went to the firm that I went to so that I could work in every different department, sort of map out how the money works. And at some point I came to the realization, it's all being rigged from Washington. So off I went to Washington, and then became very committed to the idea that what we needed was to re-engineer the economics each place at a time. So basically, understand how communities could circulate equity and do much more financing locally. And I proceeded to build software tools that would help you map out how the federal government worked by place. So bring transparency to the federal government, and ended up in quite an amazing food fight with the Department of Justice and litigating with the federal government. They stole all of our software and kept it under lock and key for 6 years. It took us 6 years to get it out. And what I discovered is the sort of central control of the economy is really being controlled through the federal budgets and through the financial system. And so that really underscored to me the importance of transparency if we're going to find real solutions to whatever ails us, whether it's political or financial problems. And so I ended up starting the Solari Report. It's interesting, during the litigation, Carrie, I did a lot of radio shows and interviews, and kept getting asked questions, and I kept trying to answer the questions and answer the questions and answer the questions. And ultimately it led to starting the Solari Report. And I had a couple of absolutely dreadful experiences, both in the administration with the New York Times and then during the litigation with the Washington Post. And I came to the conclusion that the corporate media was completely useless, which is why you and I, you probably backed into the media business the same way I did. Anyway, so I started the Solari Report, but a lot of people wanted sort of more in-depth help understanding how to use this knowledge to change how they manage their lives and their families' risk issues. And so I became an investment advisor. So I have two jobs. One, and basically what I say is my interest is in helping people live a free and inspired life. How can we understand what's really going on in a way that makes a great difference to our families, our children, our grandchildren, and does it in a way that helps bring change? Because I think one thing I can say for most people in America, I think most of us think it's not working. And it's true. It's not just America. I just got back from Europe, and you see many of the same concerns in Europe, although it's still a much more human culture.
Yeah, that's interesting, to kind of contemplate the fact that there is some more what one might call sort of humanizing elements in Europe. And I was just discussing that with a friend, so it's an interesting thing that you brought that up. And just talking about how you can sit. I went to I'm not going to say which city. It's here in the Los Angeles area, and we went to sit out in a garden area where it was, it's a fairly sophisticated city, et cetera. And what I noticed about it was there was a lot of cameras, a lot of surveillance, but people were not relaxed. It's funny, they were there eating sandwiches or hanging out with friends, et cetera, but they didn't have the same tone of relaxation that you get in Europe.
Right.
And I was struggling to sort of explain that to someone I was with, and we were sort of mulling it over. We've spent a lot of time in Europe, and I love the outdoor cafes. I love the whole relaxed atmosphere of, they are used to being, of course, I live in California, and we don't have a very much of a culture in which people mill around and relax.
Right.
And we were sort of talking about how there's sort of an overtone that if you're not busy doing something, you're loitering, and therefore could be arrested or questioned or whatever here in the States.
I think the digital systems here are so much more invasive. Curtis Mayfield published a great album in 1989 called The New World Order, and he had a song in it where he said, "It's a new world order, it's a brand new day, it's a new world order, and brother, you're the prey." Right. And I think increasingly people in America, you're a target of either surveillance capitalism or intelligence agency surveillance, and the digital systems are very invasive. I also think you have an overlay of entrainment and subliminal programming and all sorts of technology designed to create addictions in consumers, particularly online addictions. And it's very, very, it's a very, very dark sense of having a extremely win-lose relationship with most corporations or governments.
Absolutely. So what I want to do today is, again, kind of bring this up to the present day in terms of your look at finance and how you think the Trump administration may sort of bear, for this situation here in America, but also looking at global finance, looking at the possibly even what I look at, which is the false flags and how they may be impacting us in terms of the legislation and or the moves they may be making, and where money may be going sort of on the globe. And also get your take on of course the Black Project money, and if you think anything has changed there and or escalated.
Well, I think what we're seeing is a situation where the establishment in the G7 nations is under extreme pressure. It's under extreme pressure because for 500 years we've had a financial model. I call it the central banking warfare model. So the central banks print money, and then the military makes sure everybody takes it in exchange for natural resources. And that model has kind of run the limit of where it can go. And one of the reasons it's run the limit, if you look at what we've done with global debt, we have taken global debt up, and we solved a lot of our problems by just paying everybody off with more currency debasement and debt. But we're really hitting at a sort of a limit on where we can go with that. You'll hear financial people talk about it's the end of the great bond bull, but part of that is we're hitting limits as to what we can do with our debt capacity. And that means rather than solve our problems with just printing money or issuing more government debt, we're going to have to try and change things. Now, one of the challenges of changing things, I do a lot with the U.S. federal budget, and this strikes right at the heart of the different budget wars you're seeing in D.C., and that is, we have literally, since World War II, been financing two civilizations from the budget of one, and keeping the one secret from the other. So, you know how you read these stories of men who had two families in two different cities and they somehow managed to keep them secret from each other for 20 or 30 years?
Yes.
You know, it's a similar story. We've got, you know, Papa has two families and one family is completely clueless that the other exists. And all the revenues of the first family is financing both. And that's a big problem because now, you know, you're going to have to re-engineer the budget. And how do you re-engineer the budget without the first family figuring out that the second family exists? So, you know, we have this parallel universe problem. And it's one of the reasons I believe they engineered a financial coup d'etat, because we've watched trillions of dollars moved out of the U.S. federal government, and I suspect in other governments too. So we're coming into that head, if you will. And the reason I say the establishment is under so much pressure is the central banking warfare model has kind of run its limit. The debt growth model has run its limit. It has to re-engineer things. The problem is, how does it keep the cash flow working, and how does it do it in secrecy? And what we've seen in the last, you know, one way the establishment was going to run things was with rules. So I don't know if you've read Patrick Wood's new book, Technocracy Rising.
No.
Great description of how the leadership decided they'd run things with very complex rule systems instead of with markets and prices. And, you know, the problem is, if you look at the election last year, the presidential election, a lot of that was just the people doing concrete functions in the heartland saying, no, we can't stand this. We're being inundated with rules, and it's unbearable and it's uneconomic. And so the rule system isn't working, and we're seeing tremendous backlash both in Europe and in the United States. It's really funny, Kara. I came through, I was just in Belgium, and I landed in Brussels and then took the train from the airport through Brussels out to, I was doing a workshop in Bruges. So we come through Brussels and everybody gets on Brussels as commuters to go home. You have never seen a sadder, more depressed group of people than the people who got on that train. All I can tell you is they're feeling the heat of everybody in Europe, just furious about all the rules coming out of Brussels, you know, and you could tell they were like, oh wow. It was kind of funny. Anyway, so the system isn't working, and yet I think the leadership doesn't know how they get to a new model, particularly on a global basis. And what we're watching, you know, the Trump administration came in strong, was trying to keep their promises, doing all sorts of things. Suddenly, in the last 2 weeks, after months of hearing nothing but screams and complaints from the Washington establishment, we're seeing the Trump administration do so many U-turns, it looks like they're going around in circles.
Right.
And all of a sudden, we're on board for the neocon vision of taking out 7 countries in 5 years that General Clark told us about, warned us about. And it looks to me like that is extreme pressure to continue getting everybody into the central banking system so that you can move to a digital currency and cancel cash, which is what they need to keep the harvesting model going, is my guess.
Well, so how does China how does China factor into this? Because, you know, the whole push for them to take over, you know, what was the standard, the dollar, and go to the yen and so on. I mean, they've made that move, right? And we're still sort of in a middle ground, I guess you might call it. It seems to me. I have somebody else who's a financial person talking to me about this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. They're saying that they're seeing a big move of China into the United States, and, you know, taking things over. So I don't know if you're seeing that. Do you have any thoughts about China's role here?
Well, China has a very important role because China is you have 1.3 billion people in China, approximately the same in India, and the China and East Asia are converging with the Western world in terms of per capita income. So we expect to be at a point where they're converging. And if you look at the size of their market, first the United States was the market, the place to be, then Europe, because the EU brought together a larger group of citizens / consumers. Now, if Asia is going to converge, then you're talking about a huge juggernaut that can really swing the market one way or another. And so China by its size is enormous in its impact of any market. There's a great documentary, if you haven't seen it, called Red Obsession, done by a group of Australians. Russell Crowe is the narrator, and it talks about the Chinese cornering the Bordeaux wine market 2 years during the 2000s. And it shows you, it's really marvelous because it shows you this relatively small market by financial standards, and the Chinese suddenly swarming in and throwing the whole market, basically pushing everybody out and throwing the whole market into a completely big shift. And it's very interesting. So China has a major impact. If you look at power politics, though, China is still far less powerful than the United States or the G7, even though their GNP is, depends on who you talk to, is surpassed ours or will shortly. So I think, the power politics or G7 still has the power, but that's shifting. And the big question for all of us is, how do we adjust from a world where we were going to be the unipolar empire to a world where we're sharing power and collaborating? And part of that, of course, plays out in the currency, which is why you see the yuan going into the SDR. But it's still early for the yuan because the Chinese still don't have a global GIS satellite in play. They still don't have a global navy in play. So if you look at all the things you'd need to replace the US currency as reserve currency, they have none of that infrastructure in play, although they're clearly building towards it. So, and it's one of the reasons I think you're watching a space race. Let me just say one more thing, because if you step back and you ask the question, why did we globalize in the 90s? Why did we institute the Uruguay round of GATT? Why did we do the WTO? I have to tell you, my guess is that if you want to become a multi-planetary civilization and you want to do it quickly and you want to do it economically, then you need China and India. And if you look at what China and India are doing in space, if you look at their, the Chinese now have more people in their space program than the United States has in its. So if you want to become a multi-planetary civilization and you want to become one fast, then you need Asia in the tent playing.
Yeah,
and it's very interesting.
Yes.
I don't know if you saw the movie The Martian with Matt Damon.
Oh, yes.
But sure enough, there's the Chinese Space Agency coming in and partnering to save the day.
Right.
Very important.
An interesting.
Very important message there.
Yeah, political statement, perhaps even a bit convenient, so to speak, and maybe propaganda, you might say, which is okay. Nothing wrong with Hollywood's doing this constantly. I mean, it is a PR battle, right? So if someone wants to sort of please China, then they're going to give them a little FaceTime, so to speak, as they call it. But, there is so much going on right now with North Korea. And I'm wondering, what's happening, or what seems to happen, is that China is supposed to be the one. That seems to be the play. And the situation is getting very, well, at least in terms of the press, which you can never trust. But, in essence, it seems to be heating up with North Korea. And Trump is making some statements, sort of puffing himself up and so on in that regard. So a lot of this is odd, because the end game is useless. The end game goes nowhere for anyone. And yet I wonder, because nothing is happening by itself. Nothing is on its own. So why the push to aggravate North Korea at this time. There may be some political something going on, machinations behind the scene that may even be financial to bring China in closer into, you know what I'm saying? And where that goes, I don't know. Have you thought about this? I mean, it must be on everyone's mind, I imagine.
Well, I think North Korea, if you go to the Bank of International Settlements and you look at the member central banks, North Korea is not on the list. So if you're going to have a global digital currency, you need North Korea in the mix, or you need North and South Korea to merge. Now, we know from, I don't know if you just saw the recent disclosure from WikiLeaks about the Goldman Sachs speeches by Hillary Clinton. She talks about why they don't want the United States doesn't want North Korea and South Korea to merge. So traditionally, the U.S. has not wanted North Korea and South Korea to merge, so they've been comfortable to keep them apart. I think the number one concern of the Chinese is they don't want all the North Koreans moving in and being responsible to feed them or find jobs for them. So China is worried about an immigration problem, is sort of my view on the thing. But if you look at what North Korea has been doing with weapons and nuclear testing, if they do take any more steps to do nuclear tests or to prove that they can deliver a nuclear bomb, certainly to any of our allies in the South China Sea or that area, I think one of the concerns is if North Korea has it, they'll sell it to Iran quickly for a certain amount of money. So nuclear proliferation is a real issue if they really do have the technology. So it wouldn't surprise me to see the Chinese. I think from what we saw with Xi Jinping's summit with President Trump, Trump is really looking for the Chinese to solve this problem, because the Chinese have the economic clout with North Korea to basically cause North Korea to do essentially whatever they want. So Trump seems to be looking to China to solve the problem and to make it worth their while on trade deals, which he can do, or certainly the United States can do. So I know there's a lot of scary headlines in the press, but I think the reality is, are we willing to cause the Chinese to do what they have to do? And are the Chinese willing to do it?
Okay, well, I don't know what even Zero Hedge has an article today about a possible preemptive strike on North Korea. This kind of thing is, it's grandstanding at the same time. You know what I'm saying? How long it goes on and what kind of trigger happy situation is going on, I don't know. I do know that under these circumstances, and I realize that this is sort of more political than your specific area, but everything affects finance, and I'm sure you agree with that. So I just want to say that, under the circumstances, North Korea at least has demonstrated a lack of cool-headedness, I guess you might call it, at least in the way they speak. Now, whether that gets followed by actual action, I mean, these testing of nuclear bombs and so on seems absurd. But it does seem that, in other words, you're not going to have a war with North Korea in conventional sense at this day and age. You know what I'm saying? In other words, there's not going to be, because North Korea at this point has at least demonstrated that they can take a missile and aim it at the United States. So that's the kind of fallout that, in other words, you can't have one strike and then another strike and so on, because by that time, North Korea won't exist. You know what I'm saying? So right. This is right on the borders of China.
Here's the problem, and I just quoted Sam Huntington, and I'll do it again, who said, the West won not through superiority of values or intellect, but through superiority with force. And that's a fact. And, we basically ruled the world by force, and both covert and overt. And the reality is, the way the world decides to rebalance against us is to also use force. And I think the challenge is, how do we get out of that how do we get out of that culture? I'm always amazed watching. I feel like I'm watching, about 100 alpha males do a complete global meltdown.
Yeah.
And I will never again, if anybody ever tells me that women are too emotional to be leaders.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. I see. Well,
yeah, really.
Where
Well,
do you see alpha males?
absolutely. Well, I mean, there's other topics that I also want to get into with you. For one thing,
Right.
Brexit, I wanted to ask how you feel. There has been a lot of, again, sort of pontification about how Brexit could affect the United States, which is strange to me. And I don't even know if Brexit is really going to achieve what they supposedly are setting out to do. What's your take on Brexit, if any?
Well, I think the Brits, I really believe this came top down within the British leadership. I think the Queen and the leadership decided they really wanted to pull apart from the European Union, that they couldn't basically steer their ship and hang together. And so what you saw was much more of a pulling away and wanting to go deeper financially in terms of organization with the Anglo-American Alliance. I also think part of that was drawing closer to East Asia and China. So I think the Queen's decision came after the meeting with Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership, which was, I think, a very important summit in the evolution of things. But I think it was the right decision. I think trying to come together in the way that we have, trying to force something with NAFTA, trying to force something in the European Union, you're talking about very unnatural centralization and trying to run things with rules, and it doesn't work. So, one of Britain's great strengths has been culture. And that culture really has been, I think, the key to their secret. And it's also the key to their success as the financial center of the world. So I think they didn't see a way of maintaining that culture and staying a part of the European Union. It's why they never went into the euro. And so they had to fill or kill. You had to really go into a shared military and into a shared currency or get out. And I think get out was the right decision for them.
Right. Well, you know what? I happen to agree with you that in fact, I had some other, whistleblower who had given me a heads up about Brexit way in advance of the actual vote, et cetera. And he predicted, his name is Cameron, and he has since disappeared off sort of the radar and had a number of problems as a result of coming forward. He was also mistaken on a number of levels, but his financial, he and his family worked in the high levels of British finance. And he told me in advance that, this idea of Brexit was a plan. And so, I mean, I know that a lot of people want to believe that the people have spoken, and the people spoke, yes, but however, they didn't carry the power, in my view, in Britain, I don't think they do. So that seems to be what goes on.
I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, because I think they were getting frustrated and seeing the same things that the leadership was, although they would describe it differently, and it comes through different venues. And I think, I think there's a communication that happens between the people and the leadership. So, it's funny, the leadership keeps doing referendums and election process because they learn from it. So I think there is a communication happening there. I agree the power's at the top. The system is run top down, but I think the top does not just ignore the intelligence that comes in a referendum or an election. They take it seriously.
Okay. I've actually been spending a lot of time in Britain. I'm also aware that, the actual people are suffering greatly there.
Yes,
and as a result of a lot of things going on. And it does not appear. One thing I love is that the English people will hit the streets and will make their opinions known, but it doesn't I'm sorry to say, but it doesn't seem to have a big impact on British politics and what they end up doing, at least thus far, at least at the moment. So, I mean, you can always go back and forth with that argument, but I see the sort of Illuminati having a very, very heavy hand in Britain,
Right.
and
Right.
in fact, I see more freedom in France. I spend
Much.
time living
Right.
in France, periodically for a few weeks in the summer. And the spirit on the street and the people is so upbeat. Whereas if you're in Britain,
Right.
the spirit on the street is not upbeat. It's actually very downtrodden. Right. So if that's
Right.
any kind of reflection of what's going on there, it is interesting to look at the people and see where they're at now. And the United States is a much more mixed bag. We're much larger. There's going to be all different kind of areas and factions. Where I live, you wouldn't know there was a recession, so to speak. And yet we have a huge unemployment in the United States, absolutely huge.
Right.
And so many people have basically even given up looking for work. It seems to me some have been smart and tried to become self-employed, which is a great avenue. But this is also where we're going. And in other words, what are people doing here? Because I don't know how much time you spend with the financial, when you examine the financial system, with looking at 3D printers as the future, and the fact that jobs are going away. A lot of jobs are going away, and
Right.
Trump's sort of new emphasis on, bring back the coal industry. This is, to me, it's ludicrous. It may be sort of a temporary Band-Aid on that part of the country that, still thinks that they can make a living by going down into coal mines. But, that's not the future of the planet, and it's not the future of the United States even. So how do you look at all that?
Well, we have gone as a civilization through many periods where technology completely reduced the number of people you needed to, so in the medieval ages, 80% of the population worked in agriculture. In the United States, less than 1%. Now less than 1% of the population can feed the whole population and export. So we've been through this, many times as a civilization. We have to go through it again. And the key to going through it successfully is you need capital to be free to shift out of the old functions into the new. So I call it global 2.0 and 3.0, 2.0 being the industrial economy, 3.0 being the sort of digitized network economy. What you need to do is you need to let people and capital flow, and that includes, skills and education. And what we have done with the rules is we have basically shut down the entrepreneurial and small business culture. We've basically made it illegal to start a company and build it, on Main Street in the United States. And what that is doing is it's causing, employment to diminish in global 2.0, but it's making it impossible to start a business and make money in global 3.0. And it's very bizarre, Carrie, because why would you want to stop that entrepreneurial process? That's how you build the new economy.
Absolutely.
And yet we've basically seen through the regulatory mechanism and through the control of capital, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, all these groups have literally made it impossible for Main Street to grab 3.0 and go. It's bizarre beyond words.
Well, can you explain that a little more? Because, of course, I live again in California, and I grew up in what's known as Silicon Valley, and I still have I still see that area as fun. Well, of course, it's very linked, and you I'm sure aware of this. It's very linked to the secret space program, right? And the same
Right.
with LA and the defense industry. And so that's where it goes. In other words, and maybe this is what you're saying. I don't know what the regulations are saying on for the smaller business, but I do know that innovation has always been what feeds the engine, so to speak. And then what happens is the whole syndrome that went on with Microsoft, where basically the entrepreneur would start a company, Bill Gates would go out fishing, and then he would buy up all the ones that had promise and take them over and sort of scoop them up. So, but there was still, there was still a funnel, there's still a movement in that direction of innovation. And so if you, are you saying that you think that's not happening anymore, or it's shutting down?
No, if you look at small business entrepreneurship, I think the Trump victory has been very helpful to small business in America. But let's just talk cost of capital. If I live in Hickory Valley, Tennessee, which is a town, we've got about a downtown population of about 150 and an SMSA of 1,200. Our leading business, I live across the street from the Hickory Valley Cotton Gin, and we have a post office and a grocery store with a little gas pump. Okay, so that's our economy. I can literally walk out of my house and within 10 minutes spend my entire net worth on lottery tickets. I can, within a reasonable drive, spend my entire net worth on illegal narcotics. If, however, I put together a local stock market and try and finance the local businesses with equity, I'll go to jail.
How is that possible?
Well, if you look at all of the rules, and I've written extensively about this, if you look at all of the rules related to organizing and financing, a business with equity, especially for people who are not accredited investors worth $1 million or more, the rules are very complicated, very draconian, and make it literally impossible for two neighbors to get together and, create a company, sell stock to their neighbors, and be off and running.
Okay.
Now, and one of the reasons you're seeing so much success with crowdfunding is literally we're at the point where people say, I'd rather just gift the money. I'll just gift you money and you just gift me money, and that's how we'll do it. Okay? Now, let's keep talking. If you come into any neighborhood in America, a big company coming in with franchises trying to take over the local market can borrow debt at 1% and can raise capital from our pension funds and retirement savings relatively easy. If you look at the local business there, they have to pay literally 10 to 30% for their debt. They probably have a very high cost of capital, and they can't raise equity capital locally, or it's very expensive and very difficult. So one player has a very low subsidized cost of capital. The other has a very high cost of capital. Now let me keep going. The small businesses with a high cost of capital, literally, if they want to start a 401k or retirement plan for their employees, let's say they put 5% of their profits every year in retirement plans for their employees. By law, they have to send that money into a money manager who's going to invest that money in the stocks of the company that are coming in and taking over their neighborhood. They can't put that money into a local venture fund or a local mutual fund that finances all the businesses in that neighborhood. Okay?
Yeah, I hear you.
You have engineered a financial system that makes it very easy to centralize control. And if you go back through the history of that model, one of the ways you really turbo powered that market was you brought narcotics trafficking into a neighborhood, generated lots of cash, and laundered it by financing the companies that were coming in and taking over the market. And that way, it's an economic warfare model. That way, all the small businesses are so busy getting their kids out of the local prison, they're completely overwhelmed. They can't sit down and figure out how to stop you from coming in and taking over their whole market. So, okay. we have literally engineered local control. Now let's keep going. I live next to a dairy farm that's out of business. Why is it out of business? It's out of business because the food safety rules put it out of business. There's no reason why a farmer couldn't have a dairy farm next to me and produce wonderful milk and sell it to all his neighbors, except he would go to jail. Okay? So whether on the asset side of the balance sheet or the capital side of the balance sheet, we have basically rigged the game for the large guys. And if you want an entrepreneurial company that can really thrive, then you need to let equity flow to the highest performance, and you need to let the rules protect the lawful instead of the criminals. So,
Absolutely.
We have two classes in society in this country, one that doesn't have to obey the law. Look at, just go look at the history of JP Morgan Chase.
Yes.
They don't have to obey the law. And when they break the law, they can just give a kickback to the Department of Justice, which helps their budget, and on they go. So, but if you look at the laws applied to me and my neighbors, it's unbelievable. So the reality, now let's just keep going with government contracting. There was a wonderful woman in Florida who lost her job. She was on food stamps. She called into the technical support because she had a problem with her food stamps, and she got somebody in India working for JP Morgan Chase. And she said, wait a minute, the government is paying JP Morgan Chase a markup to pay somebody in India to do a job that if I did, I wouldn't need food stamps. So the government's paying me not to work while they're paying somebody in India to do the job, and then they're paying JP Morgan Chase a markup. They're paying twice for something that they could pay once for.
Yes.
Okay. And if you go down through the government contracting budget, you will find unbelievable number of examples where we are paying some corporation to do something, for anywhere from $50 to $150 an hour that one of my neighbors would love to do for $25 plus healthcare. Now, when I started my company in Washington, we were an investment bank, but we did financial software. And we built a software tool called Community Wizard that would allow you to access all the federal data on sources of uses of government money in your county or your zip code, your place. And the whole point was to say, all the government money related to your place, how could the local guys save money for the taxpayers by re-engineering the federal government money? And what you'll find again and again, whether it's the food safety rules, the SEC rules related to cost of capital, or government contracting, there are a gazillion ways that we can solve the federal budget problem, and in a way that creates massive employment in this country, particularly in areas where we can do it better locally. I'm sure you can grow food locally better than you can 1,000 miles away. So there are solutions to all these problems, but they all require transparency. The local economies through the federal budget are rigged for tight central control. And the reason they're rigged for tight central control is because they are trying to soak up a huge amount of money secretly. So,
Yes.
For example, if you try and stop the narcotics trafficking in your county, what you'll discover is you're financing Tony Soprano, who's financing James Bond, and the black helicopters are going to come down on your head because everybody needs that money and nobody wants any county to get out of the model.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes, absolutely.
So, and I'm sure you've run into that before, which is why my dream was always to help turn the economic model in a way that could make us much wealthier as a civilization and a society. And I kept running into this drain that was going through Tony Soprano and James Bond. And that's finally why I went to look at the secret space program stuff, because every time I tried to talk to people about roads and bridges, they wanted to talk to me about UFOs. And my attitude was, you're just entertainment junkies. And finally, I realized, no, they're not just entertainment junkies, because all this money is disappearing down a rabbit hole.
Absolutely.
And it's financing $150 trillion of hardware that's floating around in the skies. Yes. It's like, okay, did Lockheed build that? Did Raytheon build that? Who built that? But whoever built it is making a lot of money. Okay, I need to look at that.
Yeah, was wonderful and brilliant for you to do that. Now you're painting a great picture here of what is, and I know that what you want to do is change that picture to make it more, humane to live here on the planet. The trouble we have is that wraps into this whole secret space program notion is that we have a number of leaders in every country, really, and governments and all their minions and the press who are backing them up with an agenda. And that agenda does not include making life better in the United States, in spite of what Trump's, platform was when he was president. So, in other words, they are doing it on purpose. they're doing it with an agenda. And so how do you get them to stop? And I just want to throw one other little thing in there with that question, which is, I was in France this summer, and what I came across was on the streets in Paris, they, first of all, they actually, I'm sure that they created a problem with the Seine overflowing. Okay. And that came down from the mountains, and it caused a problem in Paris, but it was interesting because it seemed to be orchestrated. And while I was there, I also saw that if you walk the streets and you go in the shops, more and more shops, especially in a certain area called Le Marais, and I may not be pronounced, I don't speak French, but at any rate, I talked to the shop owners, and they told me they had a wonderful sort of sense of, patriotism for their own country, but at the same time, they were saying, we are not standing with the government. We're doing our own thing, and we are entrepreneurs. And they are doing creative, incredible things with little tiny shops that are cropping and restaurants, and making the whole area like this creative, thriving, amazing place. And the energy there is phenomenal, and it's just inspiring. And I thought to myself, why is the United States not like this? What has happened here that we are so locked down that you don't get that kind of energy, that entrepreneurial energy?
Because I've seen that start many times and be shut down by operations using invasive technology. So the control, the economic control, the financial control is very much engineered through, I call it the data beast. And the effort to keep everybody in the system and divide and conquer is very, very strong.
Sure.
So, literally the control is that, we are that micromanaged, and very invisibly so.
Right. So again, the first part of my question, though, to talk about the agenda and to talk about, the bottom line here. I mean, you yourself, I don't know how you view your position at this time, but are you just trying to make ends meet, just trying to stay alive? Are you trying to push the envelope, trying to get some kind of, legislation? Do you believe legislation is even the answer? I mean, in other words, we're talking about turning a ship around, in a sense, the ship of the planet.
Right. So what I've been trying for 20 years is to persuade folks that what you need is a massive movement of our time and money. So if we're going to bring about real change, what I'm interested in is real change. I'm interested in transforming the economic and financial model of the planet.
Sure.
But in the process of doing it, I like to think very small. So I like to think, how can one family with 2 parents and 2 kids shift their own economics in a way that shifts us towards positive change? So I'm very sort of nuts and bolts. And I started with trying to get everybody to move their money out of the bank accounts that was doing all the fraud, and was completely astonished at my complete failure to persuade everybody to, stop doing business with criminal enterprise. Everybody's looking at the criminal enterprise and thinking those guys are the winners. So let me tell you a story. In the summer of 2000, I went to a wonderful Christian revival in Atlanta, and I was with a church group. It was a church I was in, and I was in this great revival, and it's T.D. Jakes from Dallas. And so I was in the Atlanta Dome with, 100,000 plus mostly African-American women. And T.D. Jakes, being from Texas, brought George W. Bush in to speak to the crowd. This is during the election. And everybody jumps up and cheers for Bush, including the pastor next to me. I was taking a course on spiritual warfare. She jumps up and cheers for them. And afterwards I said, Patricia, you just jumped up and cheered for the guy. Bush family and Clinton family narcotics are destroying all these neighborhoods. You just jumped up and cheered for the guy who's doing that. And she said, well, he's going to be the winner. And I said, well, you never jumped up and cheered for me. I'm trying to stop them doing that narcotics trafficking. And you never jumped up and cheered for me. And she said, well, you're the loser.
So, all right.
So in America, as long as we back the winners, and the winners are the people destroying our neighborhoods and businesses with criminal enterprise, it's going to continue. So what is it going to take to shift the consciousness and to shift, our behavior and our money? Because that's what will shift it. Not, whoever is a prison, the president is a prisoner.
Sure.
So let me tell you another story.
I agree with that.
I think I went through the red button problem with you.
I'm not sure. It's been a while since we talked, so go ahead.
Okay. In the summer of 2000, I was giving a speech to a group of people called Spiritual Frontiers Foundation. Wonderful group of people, very financially literate, very well educated. They have a conference once a year on how to evolve our society spiritually. So a friend of mine had asked me to give a speech on, it's called How the Money Works on Organized Crime, that later became my article, Narco Dollars for Beginners. It's supposed to be a light, funny explanation of the economics of crime and sort of how Washington and Wall Street are addicted to dirty money. So I'm in the middle of the speech and I'm explaining the Dark Alliance allegations and the congressional testimony about the CIA drug dealing into South Central LA. And the fact that at the time of the testimony, a Department of Justice spokesperson had told a reporter I was helping that the U.S. economy launders $500 billion to $1 trillion a year. And that's all illegal funds. That's financial fraud, narcotics trafficking. And I assure you, we were the leader then, and it's much bigger, and we're the leader now. So I said to this wonderful group of spiritually evolved people, what would happen if we stopped being the global leader in money laundering? And they said, well, we'd have problem financing the government deficit, and we'd have, that money wouldn't come to the New York Stock Exchange. It would go to Hong Kong or Zurich or Singapore. And I said, okay, well, let's pretend there's a big red button up here on the lectern. And if you push that button, you can stop all hard narcotics trafficking in your town, your county, your state, your country tomorrow, thus offending the people who control $500 billion to $1 trillion of all dirty money and the accumulated capital thereon. So I said, okay, who here will push the button? And out of 100 people dedicated to evolving our society spiritually, only one would push the button. 99 would not push the button. I didn't vote. It would have been 2. So I said to them, why would you not push the button? And they said, we don't want our government checks to stop. We don't want our taxes to go up, and we don't want our IRAs and 401ks to go down in value.
But that's a tragedy. That's very self-involved.
But here was the problem. The problem was not that they wouldn't push the red button. The problem was that they wouldn't admit to that and get in the invention room and say, how do we turn the red button green? How do we make money pushing the red button? Because if we can figure out, because you can't make money liquidating your entire society. You can't make money if nobody in the neighborhood trusts each other, because we're all complicit in allowing drugs to be, come in and target our children. The trust is going to break down, which is exactly what's happening. So, but here's the problem. If you vote for somebody for president and they go in, so you're Donald Trump, you arrive in the Oval Office, and your Karl Rove guy comes in. So Steve Bannon comes in, he says, well, everybody in America elected you, and now they all want their check. And Steve Mnuchin says, well, you got to be nice to the people who control $500 billion to $1 trillion a year. And you can't push the red button unless you have an 80% consensus. So, what we were always trained in Washington is you have to have an 80% consensus to turn the aircraft carrier. Well, where is the 80% consensus? We have all of America blaming Donald Trump and the Congress for not being able to come up with a new healthcare policy. Well, no one in America is willing to be reasonable. The general population is not willing to be reasonable. The pharmaceutical companies are not willing to be reasonable. The stock investors are not willing to be reasonable. The insurance companies are not willing to be reasonable. Everybody's sitting here on a bloated debt economy, and they have no clear vision of how to move to something which is economically feasible. Switzerland pays $6,000 a year for health care per capita. We pay $9,000, and I assure you the Swiss are much healthier than we are. So, America is in a state of deep, deep denial, and that's why I think one of the most important issues before us is how do we create a media capacity that will help America get out of denial and get onto get into the future on a productive way. And part of that is getting out of this cycle of disrespect between the general population and the establishment. I think the establishment wants war because they're scared to death about what's about to come out about pedophilia, and some of the other deepest, darkest secrets. Between the financial coup d'etat, last year, Carrie, the Department of Defense had undocumentable adjustments of $6.5 trillion. That's what I call a cut and run.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they stole every last drop.
Well,
we now have over 11.5 trillion of undocumentable adjustments. The federal government has not complied with the laws related to audited financial statements or financial management or the appropriation provisions of the Constitution for the last, many, many decades. And I think that's why they want a constitutional convention. They want to take the Constitution and they want to tear it up because, they're terrified that somebody's going to enforce it. Where is the 11.5 trillion? Because if you're going to hold the citizenry responsible for the debt, if you're going to say, okay, I as a citizen am responsible for 20 trillion, then I want that 11.5 trillion back on the table. So maybe it's all in spaceships now, but I want an equity interest in those spaceships. I own those spaceships. That technology you gave to Silicon Valley, I own that. Let's put it all back on the table.
Absolutely. Well, I applaud the statement. I don't know where we're going to get any traction with it. That's the issue. And I think, this is one of those things where maybe it has to crash in some substantial way before the change occurs. Now, there is another side to this that involves things like, Michael Tellinger's Ubuntu and small sort of groups of people sort of withdrawing from the game, so to speak, in the best ways they can. And I do think there is some of that going on at this time. How successful they'll be, because, in a certain sense, philosophically, I'm not with an isolationist mentality. I don't think it really helps anyone, but I do understand the motivation for wanting, to have that. And we do need to, in essence, turn that ship around, but it's not coming. It's not going to come very easily. And we do have, now some people believe, and I don't know where you're going with this or where you might go with this, but some people do believe that I've been told that the Navy, that there was a coup in a sense, and that Trump, because Hillary was supposed to be in line and supposed to just, in lockstep go forward and take over the presidency, et cetera. But instead what we got was a new guy who was, I am told, backed by the Navy, and who many people who are not even right wingers have great faith in to somehow turn this ship around, or at least interrupt its progress going down this sort of deep, dark hole, especially with regard to the United States. However, the latest news does not sort of reflect their hopes, so to speak. So, what would you say about that? In other words, they're putting a lot of emphasis on who's president. And of course, that's a problem because that's not who runs the planet or the country. But nonetheless, he is a reflection, however, of a certain faction. And it is said, I was actually told that 3 men, and this is coming from a Navy guy, 3 men were responsible for Trump getting elected. Not the whole population of the United States, but 3 men. They were glad that the population also, in some form or fashion in the voting, depending on how much you trust those numbers, did reflect that as well. There was a dissatisfaction that he was speaking to and seemed to, have some resonance with. But nonetheless, that's what I was told. 3 men.
Well, I think that, in theory, that's possible, when it comes down to the final decision, because at the end it gets very centralized. But I think what Trump offers, and still does offer no matter where we are right now, Trump is someone who can price out everything. And let's just pretend for a second that you have leadership within the Navy, which is pretty solid, and wants to make sure whatever we do, we don't get ourselves into a war that we lose or destroys the U.S. military. And, they're pretty sensible because it's the Navy both running the sea lanes and, I believe, running the secret space program, which is right at the heart of operationalizing everything. So let's say you've got some guys who are smart about what it's going to take to operationalize. I think they looked at Trump, and Trump was willing to walk into the middle of Washington and start talking prices. One of his greatest lines was when he said to Boeing, we want you to make money, but not that much money. Because the defense industry is completely out of control and non-productive. The Indians and the Chinese are about to whoop their ass. So, there has to be, somebody has to walk into a culture that has had a zero cost of capital and introduce the unique notion of real cost of capital and the price of things. And Trump is uniquely positioned and trained and experienced to do that. So, it's certainly, what you're saying certainly fits with, I think, sort of the gist of what is going on. And that's what the group that is in charge of operations globally, Sea Lanes or Secret Space Program, they need Washington to start turning in a more economic way because the debt growth model is over. And that's their challenge, how to do that. I'm curious, if you look at the decision room at Mar-a-Lago on the decision to bomb Syria, McMaster was the only person from military or intelligence in that room. Mike Pompeo, Dan Coates, they were in that room. It looked like a board meeting of Rothschild Inc. So it was much more the central banking side than the warfare side.
Well, and perhaps that's always the case on a certain level. I mean, I've been told that generals have not been responsible for invading countries, et cetera, that all the decisions come from, the monetary side. And that is the Rothschild, sort of banking side, which is also still impacting America in a big way. So at this moment, we've been
remember two things, Carrie, just as background. So now I'm speculating. March 20th, David Rockefeller died, the guy at the top of the chain that killed Kennedy. That's a very big vacuum. That's a big power vacuum, number one. What does that have to do with what's going on here? We don't know. The second thing is the whole pedophilia story is unraveling, and the danger is not that the establishment can't hold the financial economic model together. The danger is they can't hold the establishment model together, because if you get a serious pedophilia scandal going, you're going to have a whole lot of people, instead of behaving professionally and keeping things working, are going to get scared and turn on each other. So don't underestimate the danger of Pizzagate and the Podesta emails to the fear of the ability of the leadership to think that they can keep everybody working and working in lockstep on any kind of page. And I think the danger here is, if you look at what's been coming out over the last 3 months, whether it's Pizzagate, whether it's surveillance, I just think the leadership is very scared about the ability to keep and hold the leadership together, pulling in the same direction without some kind of war or distraction of major import.
Well, that gets back to this notion that there has become a split at the top. Now there are many factions at the top, but initially that, what I have been told by more than one whistleblower behind the scenes is that, the Navy, there's a split in the Navy, that the military are basically have had it with what's going on, especially the American military, and that there is a move to change this game. And so what you get is, it's not just that the whole game is a mess and failing, but the drive to create something new is coming from a faction that is now pushing itself in. And what I wonder if war won't be like their answer. The losing side, or what would be the losing side, is basically going to put
I can't imagine that war would be their answer. It's I'll tell you a very interesting book called The New Grand Strategy. When Mike Mullen went in as I guess Joint Chief, he was trying to do a strategic planning for the military, and what he realized was the military's role in the world has to be part of the civilian and global vision for America in the world. And so he went over to the civilian leadership and said, well, what's our vision for our future in the next 20 years? The world's changing, and we need to change with it, and I need my vision to be part of your vision, and nobody had a vision. They're just doing deals and making money. No vision. And so he went back and he said, okay, well, we're going to have to come up with a vision for the military that also creates one for the civilians. Anyway, so you had a group of guys doing this in the military. They left, went to a think tank and kept it going, and then finally published a book of a new grand strategy for America. If you go to the Chinese government website, you can get all of their white papers. Chinese are planners. They got a vision for this, a vision for that, a vision for their military. It's all written down. It goes through the process. It's quite worked, and it's remarkably public. And America lacks that vision. And at the heart of the struggle, that's the question. Are we just going to keep being the military enforcement arm of the central banking warfare model? Or are we going to have a real vision for our role in the world, given the way the world is changing? Because if we continue to try and just be the global cop that runs the world on force and is building out a unipolar empire, I think it's going to fail. And so if I were the guys in the Navy and the military, I would absolutely want to be doing what you're describing, because their challenge is, how do you come up with a shared vision for America, both civilian and military, which is economic? You need transparency, and transparency gets us back to what you've been doing at Project Camelot, which is we are financing two civilizations out of one and pretending that the secret one doesn't exist. And you can't reinvent America and our role in a world without bringing transparency to that.
No doubt about it. And well said. Well, this is what we're left with. I know I've kept you for a while. I do want to give the people in the chat a chance to ask you any questions they have.
Can I just say one more thing before we close?
Go right ahead.
Okay. If you look at the current wealth on planet Earth, it's 1% of what it could be. When we built the Community Wizard software tool, and we're basically able to simulate the re-optimization of economies locally, bottom up. It's really funny. I had a brilliant guy working for me who was a PRC citizen. He'd been at Tiananmen Square and then left China. So several of his friends were killed there, and so he left and went to MIT. Brilliant guy. And I asked him to go simulate after we got all the data into the software and could really look at a place in detail. He went off and he came back and he said, the wealth could be many times more. And I said, oh, those numbers have to be wrong. You've made a mistake. I kept sending him back. And finally, he just said, no, you have to pay attention to this. I'm right, you're wrong. So I went in the numbers and I was absolutely stunned, because the control and the oppression is so enormous. People don't realize, what could be possible if we were free to just blossom and do what made the most economic sense. It's quite extraordinary. I mean, if we got back to trusting, especially with the new technology, Carrie, the new technology has incredible power to create enormous wealth. And, you name the problem, the wealth is there to do it. So
I agree with that.
I'm an optimist. I'm an absolute optimist, because I know the wealth potential which is there if we can find a way through this secrecy issue. And I would just suggest one practical step. Up on my website, there is a letter I wrote to my congressman last year, and it basically suggests how the federal government, every agency has a website. I said, look, just put up all the data for your budget on a place-based basis. If you read that letter to my congressman, just do a search, you can pick it up. Send it to your congressman, because there are solutions, and they don't require any more taxes or any more money. If every federal agency just put the data up that is supposed to, by law, be public, I assure you, the local guys can make a fortune re-engineering bottom up, and plenty of jobs, plenty of money. A lot of work, but it can be done.
I hear you. I agree with that. And one thing I did was talk with Michael Tellinger in depth about his Ubuntu project. And I don't know how successful it's really being at this point, but there is one premise that they shared with you, which is that when people get together, they generate a huge amount of wealth, that our creativity is our wealth. And if allowed to thrive, there's no doubt about it, we will thrive.
Right.
And
Right.
we have everything in the palms of our hands, so to speak. It's just to get rid of this top-down control system, really. And that's
right. And also
our
we have
problem.
to return to a system where that is not only a human system, but where no one can, it is not permitted to cross the line into inhumanity, and no one within our network or within our place can be treated with that kind of inhumanity. If you look at the inhumanity that has occurred in the United States, the psychic garbage that we are all suffering from as a result of the, decades and decades and centuries of inhumanity it's accumulated to an unbearable level. And we've got to clear that psychic garbage, which is why I believe really this has to start with a spiritual and cultural shift in consciousness.
Absolutely. Well, I would agree. Actually, I think that's happening. I think you and I are part of that. I think that, the people
Right.
in our audience are part of that. I have a great deal of optimism because of that. And because,
Right.
in my role in Camelot, I get contacted by people constantly who are awakening, and
Right.
and that their awakening benefits us. That's the bottom
Yes.
line. So,
well, the reason I never, people keep telling me that what you're doing is hopeless, and I keep saying, I don't care. Because I know, if you look at the world spiritually, which I do, it can all change in a twinkling of an eye, because that's how fast things can happen when we concur in the spiritual dimension. When we come together and agree in the spiritual dimension, whoosh, watch out.
I think that's actually, I think we're witnessing that in a big way, which is part of the reason that what's happening to the media, I believe, is that you've got I'm close to Hollywood here, and I'm seeing, the numbers leaving Hollywood and coming to things like YouTube, seeking real knowledge and getting real evidence rather than something that's packaged and so on. So there is a real movement away from all of that. Now, I have some questions here in the chat that I'd like to run by you from people, if that's okay, and then we'll let you go.
Definitely.
Okay, so someone wants to know, can we get Trump to declassify secret technologies in order to stimulate economic productivity?
In theory, yes, but it's like all of these issues. You need a consensus of 80%, a very high number of people all wanting the same thing and promoting. The way to do it is to come in through your local officials and congressmen. So if that one issue is the one we want to get to the head of the line, we can do it. I think, I suspect that Trump is very knowledgeable on this topic anyway. And part of his challenge in a highly centralized system, you're trying to get a pig through a snake. What issue is the most important to get through today? You see a lot of talking about priorities. So the question is, can we get enough people writing their congressmen, bringing it up in the media? Can we get 80% of the American people to make that a priority?
Right. Well, and that gets into this whole awakening notion, because if people aren't aware there are secret technologies, they're not going to be voting for them. But, we're aware of them. Certainly I imagine, Geordie Rose and Elon Musk are probably aware of them. But I don't know if your man on the street is aware of them. So this is...
Well, unfortunately, Elon Musk just told everybody to link their brain up to the CIA and back it up into the CIA cloud. So,
well, yeah, I think he's like anybody, he's a multi-dimensional individual, but I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt when I say that he's got to know that in a certain sense. I think he is also, in lockstep, because he's trying to reinvent the wheel that's already been done many times. And he has to know there's a technology above and beyond his own. That's where we're going. Now, someone wants to know, do you have any thoughts on Karen Hudis and the global currency reset?
I've early on when Hudis first started doing public talking, I looked at some of her stuff and didn't find it. I wasn't comfortable with it. So I really don't. I'm not familiar with anything she's done since then.
What about the second part of it?
And I don't necessarily understand what you mean by the global reset, but most of what I've heard that comes under the discussion of global reset is, to me, just disinformation. I do agree that the leadership wants to build out a global digital currency, and I believe that they're doing lots of different things to make that happen, including the push to get every country into the central banking tent. But I think how that's going to happen and when it's going to happen is a very organic process, and they're making it up as they go along. So I don't expect a big global reset anytime soon.
Okay, fair enough. Let's see, looking for anything else. Somebody wants to know about the gold connection with the Nazis and who really won World War II. That's a you deal with Joseph Farrell, and I'm going to refer to everyone.
Great question. We've done a lot of interviews on the Solari Report with Joseph Farrell, looking at because it's clear that the Nazis were able to transfer significant funds, resource, and people out of Germany and maintain a whole organizational structure. To a certain extent, it merged back into, Joseph and I, when we talked about it, said there's a metastructure. And at the end of the war, you took this chunk of Nazis and money and everything else and pulled it back in, merged it with the metastructure, and Nazi International went on. And Joseph always points out, the German nation surrendered, but the Nazi party never did. And of course, one of my favorite books on World War II is Charles Higgins' Trading with the Enemy, and then Black's book on IBM. So, it's very interesting because you had U.S. corporate interests, basically doing business with and financing and working with the Nazis throughout the war, before, during, and after. So it makes you wonder, what was that all about? And so I think the Nazi international influence is very important. And of course, the question is, did they completely merge back into the military-industrial complex, or have they maintained independence? Which of course leads us to one of the big unanswered questions of 2016, what is going on in Antarctica?
Absolutely. Well, and I'm sure Joseph has all kinds of theories on that one. I can say, to the questioner that, of course, you can look at Jim, oh God, his name's just escaping me. Anyway, it's called The Fourth Reich. And, he's a wonderful journalist, and his last name's escaping me, but Jim Mars, there it is. Yes. and he is also, along with Farrell, talking about what really happened. But also my recent interview with William Tompkins is also addressing what's going on in Antarctica, what the Nazis did in regard to the space program, how the Nazis were instrumental. And I just interviewed David Adair for 3 hours last night. And he's talking about a prime Nazi called Alan, I think it's David, no, I got the first name wrong, but Rudolph, Dr. Rudolph, and it's not Rudolf Hess. A Dr. Rudolph who was a Nazi, who was instrumental in making decisions, even in contradiction to Curtis LeMay, the general who seemed to be quite instrumental back in those days in running the secret space program. So you're talking about a real infiltration in America of the Nazis, and that they didn't just pack their bags and also didn't sort of merge quietly in with our system, so to speak. And they're still alive and well. And so the whole Antarctica thing is key to the Nazi question, really, I would say.
Right. Did you ever go through, I had a subscriber who made me go listen to all the Peter Beater podcasts. Yeah. Did you ever listen to the Peter Beater podcast?
Yeah, he's great.
I never knew what to think of Peter Beater, but one of the things he said was the Falklands War was basically the Brits going down and having a war with the Nazi base in Antarctica.
That makes perfect sense to me based on some other whistleblower testimony, for sure. It gets that gets into the black goo and what was really found there, and that was associated, I guess, with some ET race and some kind of artificial intelligence. It gets into the marketing scientists that all died.
If the genie came out of the bottle, one of the things I'd always wanted to know is the truth of what happened to Byrd in Antarctica in '49.
Well, I mean, you maybe don't know about the William Tompkins sort of statements. He's been on many shows, and I did quite a long in-person interview with him. He is addressing what happened to Admiral Byrd in certain ways.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, he talks about what he encountered at any rate. I don't think we actually, so that's worth listening to. And seems to be substantiated by others as well. I'm looking to see if there's any other. Has Trump been to any Bilderberg meetings? Is the question.
I don't know. Trump's an odd character because he is. If you look at the Council on Foreign Relations, if you look at the Bilderberger, if you look at those cultures, he was always odd man out with those groups. When I lived in New York, my the Dillon Reed public relations firm that I hired was also did Trump. And my account officer wasn't doing Trump, but the head of the firm was doing Trump. But I would always hear Trump. And Trump was, culturally and politically, he was not sort of in the club. So he was a bit of an odd man out. One, he's so temperamental and so aggressive. I think a lot of them sort of didn't want him in the club. So I don't know if he's been to a Bilderberger meeting or not, but it wouldn't surprise me if he hasn't been.
Well, that's going to be a wave of the future, I would think. I know Hillary has been. We know that's documented. So it is interesting to contemplate as a head of, the United States. He probably will be invited now. So look to that in the future, I would imagine, unless he sends somebody else in his place. Maybe Steve Bannon.
Well, I think what Trump is trying to do is he's trying to understand all the different constituencies and how he can forge a political consensus for something that heads in what he thinks is the right direction. And, I think somehow he thinks he can bring all these different groups together and forge a positive direction. I don't know if I agree with him. What's happening is if you look at anybody who would give a strong voice to the Let's Rebuild North America, you're watching the press target and destroy those people systematically. So we see Flynn knocked off. Now there's a real push to knock off Bannon. So it's making it very difficult for those voices to be heard.
Someone is asking along those lines, what do you think of Jared Kushner?
Well, I think I don't know much about Jared Kushner other than what I've read in the newspapers. My guess is he's an extremely intelligent person. He's been raised, I think, in a serious spiritual tradition. I think he's conscientious, hardworking, very bright. And I think Trump trusts him in part because he's, the loyalties are very close there. So, and I think, one of the things you really value when you're in the kind of position Trump's in is you value people who can stay calm. And Kushner seems to be very calm and kind of keep his wits about him. The challenge you have with guys like Kushner is that they're very young relatively. They don't have a lot of political experience, and so they don't know what they don't know. And I don't really know how much Kushner knows. But I would say, if you were going to pick out, I do these profiles, Carrie, where I say people are either Titanic turners, scaredy cats, pigs, or scorpions. I think Kushner is clearly a Titanic turner, but he may not have enough background and information and experience to be able to tell the difference between who's being a Titanic turner, who's being a pig, and where the scorpions are. So I think if there's a danger here, it's simply that he's young, he certainly handled himself in a very mature way. So I don't mean to say I've seen anything, but my concern is that, he sees a lot of very wealthy, successful people and thinks they're accomplished and doesn't understand their accomplishment was criminal enterprise. And so he can't see that mathematics, unfortunately, you have a crowd of people who are apt to call people losers, who are losers because they insisted on staying honest and weren't willing to engage in genocide. And I've seen Kushner pick people who I consider to be, we're, the worst of the swamp, and pick them out and bring them in. And I can't fathom that he really knows what he's doing.
Yeah.
So that tells me he may be young. And unfortunately, when you have a young person brought up to that level of influence that fast, the danger is, if you can't get them educated fast, then they're going to get educated at our expense.
Yeah, interesting. Absolutely.
But I would call Kushner a Titanic turner, and I think he's loyal to the president. And if you're the president, you need somebody who's loyal to you, who's calm and collected. And I think Kushner is calm and collected.
Okay. Someone is asking, I'm not sure what they're saying here, but ask Catherine about the future agenda incorporating low Earth orbit influence.
Well, good question. Our number one, you've seen The Kingsman, right?
Yes.
And you've seen the tapes of the Chuck E. Cheese brawls.
Well, in The Kingsman, I haven't seen them separate, but whatever.
Well, but if we build out a low Earth orbit, and I'm focused on one part of the low Earth orbit, if we build out a low Earth orbit infrastructure that has the capacity with 5G technology to mind control the whole planet, life is going to get difficult. So, but I think there are big things planned for the low Earth orbit in terms of economic development, and big things planned for asteroid mining. I don't know if I was just up at a mining conference in Toronto in March, and it's unbelievable, Carrie, to see the increased costs of mining on planet Earth. They're having to go further out, dig up more rock to get less metal, and the economics are really turning down. We just saw Goldman Sachs come out with a report recently saying asteroid mining is going to be very attractive economically. It's really feasible. Start taking it seriously. It's not surprising.
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
So
I'm not sure that's not really low Earth orbit.
No, it's not low Earth orbit, but it is an increased focus on the economic possibilities of space and building out the economic possibilities. And to me, one of my big questions on all of this is, if you're going to build out a low Earth orbit, then it needs to be safe. And right now we see, if you think that the tensions between the Chinese and the Russians and the Americans are bad on planet Earth, wait till you see what happens when we get into space.
Oh, yeah. Well, obviously it's already happening, but okay, fair enough.
And I think that's one of the reasons you see a push to consolidate into one central banking model globally, because it's very difficult to push out in space unless you have either central control or a way to collaborate and agree about how you're going to manage space weaponry among the powers.
Well, this gets into the work that I do in a big way, though. And I have to say that it really goes much beyond low Earth orbit. I don't think you can have the one. I don't think you can have the one without the other. You know what I'm saying? You can't. Right. They're not going to be independently just flying around up there and think everything's going to be fine. This is not how it works. Solar Warden would probably have something to say about that, to say nothing of the incoming and outgoing traffic that we're dealing with here, whether that are coming in on low Earth orbit and leaving and going interstellar. I was just
let me just stop you and ask you, when are we going to have space elevators, Carrie?
When are we going to have anything? When are we going to have anything commercial in space? This is a really contested area. I think, I guess Robert Bigelow is the most likely candidate to be able to answer that question. And he's basically gone on the side of the Black projects, so to speak. And I just talked with somebody who is in a position to know some things about him. So, I just interviewed Mark Richards for the 6th time in prison, and I can tell you that he, as a former captain of a space command and many craft, he's talking about what has just happened with TRAPPIST-1, and TRAPPIST-1 being a small solar system that has been discovered and reported in the news by NASA, et cetera. And he said that was a treaty that we had signed saying that we would never reveal their whereabouts, and that we have now broken this treaty, and that the beings, which he would not describe, interestingly enough, of that small system, are very angry now with us. And by us, I asked him, who's us? Because how do you put the Earth into one group? And that's in essence where you guys are going with this. How are you going to have that discussion? Well, he says this other planetary system considers us to be, of course, our secret space programs as representatives, of which we have no connection, right? Ostensibly. But at the same time, you've got the United Nations, you've got, these various alien groups who are our allies, but they're only allies of certain military groups because, the Air Force is aligned with one, the Navy with another, the Army with another, and that doesn't even count the other countries who are working with various and had made various allies, deals with various allies, to say nothing of the reptilians who feel that the Earth belongs to them. So, this is where you get into a whole talk about politics being, this is exopolitics.
Well, you can see why somebody might want centralized enforcement. Sure.
I mean, one world government in a positive way, that would be representative of all countries, et cetera, in a completely different form and fashion than the one they normally want to have, is, of course, the end, going to have to happen, because Earth has to deal with other galactic civilizations. And we have to have some kind of, in theory, unified human, group of representatives, so to speak. I mean, all of this is
but you can't get that way. You can't get there, Carrie, without transparency.
Yeah, absolutely. This is what I'm saying. And so this gets back to the whole secret space program, and the reason that, it's secret and we are not represented. So the populations of the planet are not in that dialogue. We're going to have to get into
what we need is a truth and reconciliation process. No, it's true.
Yeah, no, I get it. Absolutely.
Right. It's exactly what happened in South Africa. How can you trust your victims?
It's a huge question, and it's a great topic. Maybe we should do a whole panel discussion on that, because really it's just, it is, and we are headed in this direction. How can we have relations with other planets, other galaxies, and most of humanity know nothing about it? And not only that, but we're told they don't exist. How can you have that discussion with people that don't exist, beings that don't exist? Of course they exist.
If the West has won what it's won by force, then there are two possibilities. One is the West, force everybody into an empire where they have dictatorial control, or they figure out a way to create a collaborative global model that can come into a centralized point.
Sure.
Those are the options.
Yeah, absolutely. Last question I'm going to take here, and then I'm going to let you go. And this has been just great, Catherine. Thank you so much. Bitcoin mining. Do you want to say anything about that?
Well, I'm just about to do a Solari report on Bitcoin with a great Bitcoin aficionado. to me, Bitcoin is just Mr. Global's prototype on building out his digital currency. And my concern about Bitcoin is, if I were Mr. Global, I would want to get out of any liabilities for deposit insurance in the Western world. And if I can get everybody out of fiat currency, government fiat currency, and into digital, it's fiat not in the sense of sovereign, but in the sense of there's no gold or oil or any other asset backing, I'm much better off. So, and as I said before, I don't think Mr. Global ever does anything unless he's got a back door. So to me, Bitcoin is, I think, you're kind of playing with fire. Now I say that, and I have to tell you what a global financial market wants is to be able to transact at low cost. There's no way the emerging markets and the frontier markets can afford our transaction costs. And so I think part of the pressure to develop cryptocurrencies is to come up with a way that we can transact together globally at very low cost digitally. So on one hand, it's an enormous blessing. On the other hand, if I'm right about Mr. Global and his back door, it's also very dangerous. And so the digital currency question always brings us back, Carrie, to the governance system, which is who's in control, who enforces, and how's that going to work. And I think I've never met a digital system that wasn't compromised. I've never met a digital system that wasn't insecure. I've never met a digital system that had integrity. And so the idea of getting dependent financially on digital systems more than we are, to me, is frightening. So
right.
I have great concerns about Bitcoin. And I would just say, if you're going to put money in Bitcoin, for heaven's sakes, don't leave it on the exchange, put it in your wallet. But just understand you're on digitally insecure systems controlled by your enemy.
Right. Well, and that gets into the whole AI thing, and
right.
whether the AIs plural that may be controlling,
right.
or trying to control the financial system, even as we speak, and
right.
whether they are going to, some of whom may be created by ETs, and some of which is created by us, and then at some point they go to battle for control, and so this gets into a whole nother world. But yeah, it's a really interesting question, and
there's certain things that are worth fighting and dying for. One is the right to have cash, and the other is the right to put a gold coin in your pocket and walk away.
Okay.
I know people who are alive today because their parents or grandparents went out in the backyard, dug up the gold coins, and got out of Germany.
Right. Yeah.
So if you've ever seen that Aaron Rousseau, Aaron Rousseau was a wonderful, great man. And if you've ever seen the Aaron Rousseau video where he talks about the Rockefellers wanting to put chips in us and have digital cash, you're talking, let me just say one thing, Carrie. If you go back and study the slave trade, the American slave trade, what you discover is there were two things that killed the slave trade. And one of them was that that the City of London banks kept losing money because you couldn't perfect collateral. Now with digital technology, you can perfect collateral with chipping people, and you can even deliver mind control. And that solves the bankers' problem. It solves the bankers. It makes collateral perfection, and it makes enforcement extremely efficient and low cost. And one of the things I want to stress, I've worked at the top of Wall Street. I've worked at the top of Washington. I've dealt with the secret societies. And what I will tell you is these are people who believe in slavery. They practice slavery. And if you give them technology that will allow them to chip you and digitize and control your money and turn it off and on, we're talking about a global slavery system. So you're playing with fire here. And the idea that this technology is going to somehow set us free is completely shows a complete lack of understanding of what's happening with digital systems, where we are, and who's really running this.
Yes, well said, I have to say. So it's really a delight to have you here. I think, we've had a very nice size audience, and people, are just going on and on in the chat. So there's all, it's just a huge response to you. You really, have a huge fan base, I have to say. of people that support your work. So that's great to see. And, you know, you speak a lot of truth, and your reasoning and your background, the two together are, I think, very valuable for people. So thank you.
Well, and Carrie, I want to commend you because you have been here for years. You know, George Orwell said the number one sin was material omission. And, you know, for years, you've been going at the heart of all the material omissions of the corporate media. So, and I told you my favorite interview in the world ever was your interview with Norm Bergstrom. I make everybody watch it.
Oh, that's lovely. Oh, fabulous.
Or Robert Dean, you had an interview with Robert Dean that was just changed my life when he said, you know, it's the destiny of the children and the grandchildren in my family to travel the stars. And I said, yes, you know, so.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. That's very kind of you. So we'll wrap this up, and I want to thank you again. Any parting words you want to give, your website, et cetera, what people might tune in for, you know, soon?
Yeah, so I run the Solari Report. You can find me and all about it at solari.com. We have a new a little commentary up on the homepage called Get a Taste, where we put links to all the stuff we've made free. There's a lot of great stuff. The thing I would say, I think it's very important, is the most important thing we all have is our time. And I would take this conversation, or any of the conversations they hear when they listen to Project Camelot or the Solari Report, and say, okay, let me look at my time budget for this week, this month, this year, and let me think about how many ways I could get I call it the tapeworm, get the tapeworm out of my time, get the tapeworm out of my money, get the tapeworm out of my pocket in a way that saves me time and money. So if you can reduce your TV watching for 2 hours a week and take that 2 hours and do something which is energizing for you, like start a garden or get to know your neighbor, you know, you decide what it is that's going to improve your health and your wealth. But start really looking very ferociously at your time and making sure you're using your time to build your health and wealth in a way that is preventing the system from draining and harvesting you. And if you do that one thing, you will make a mighty contribution to the future of humanity.
Excellent. Yeah, very, very well said. Okay, thank you so much, Catherine.
Bye, Carrie. Have a wonderful Easter weekend.
Okay, take care. And it's been great. Thank you so much, everyone. This is, you know, as always, so interesting talking with the people that we get to have on our show. And it's such a pleasure. And Catherine is no exception. She is really a fount of wisdom and knowledge. And so thank you for watching. Thank you for participating, those who are part of the live show. And of course, this will go on my YouTube channel for those who missed the show, and they'll be able to watch it here. So next week, we'll have some new guests, and stay tuned to projectcamelotportal.com. Subscribe to my Twitter feed, because I always announce things right before they're going to happen right there. And you can also subscribe to the YouTube channel and get notified every time I'm going to do a video and go live, or if I post the latest interviews, of which Mark Richards is coming, and so is the John Lear 5-hour interview, I think it is. And last night's, of course, and the night before, we're with Richard Lighthouse. So we had David Adair last night, Richard Lighthouse the night before, and the day before we had Maria Wheatley, and she is a dowser and has great knowledge of ancient sites. So this has been a fascinating week, and I hope you've enjoyed it. I know I have, and we'll have more guests next week. So thanks for watching, and have a great weekend. Take care. Bye-bye.